The morning started with a nervous excitement that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had been waiting for this day for weeks, carefully ironing his shirt the night before, polishing his shoes until they looked almost new, and even rehearsing answers to questions he thought might come up in the interview. For him, this wasn't just another appointment. It felt like a chance to finally turn his life around. Jobs had been hard to come by lately, and every rejection had chipped away at his confidence. But this one felt different. It was a position that promised stability, a decent paycheck, and the respect he longed to earn. He woke up extra early to make sure nothing went wrong. The streets were still quiet when he stepped out of his small apartment, clutching his folder of papers tightly under his arm. He checked his watch again and again, reminding himself he had enough time if everything went smoothly. The bus stop wasn't far, and if the bus arrived on schedule, he would reach the office well before his slot. His heart pounded faster the closer he got, not out of fear, but from the weight of how much depended on this single morning dot as he walked. His thoughts raced between hope and doubt. What if they didn't like him? What if they thought he wasn't qualified enough? But then he reminded himself of all the hours he had spent preparing, of how badly he wanted this chance. He promised himself that no matter what happened, he would give his best. He straightened his tie, lifted his head, and told himself silently, "This is it. Today is the day." Just then, he noticed something unusual at the corner of the street. A car was pulled over to the side, its hood up, and smoke drifting faintly into the morning air. Beside it stood an older man, struggling with the engine, wiping sweat from his forehead with a cloth. At first, he told himself he shouldn't stop. He couldn't afford to be late. He needed every minute to make it to the interview. He slowed his pace, torn between responsibility and compassion. The sight of the man leaning helplessly against the car tugged at his heart. He looked so worn out, his hands trembling slightly as he fiddled with something he clearly didn't understand. He glanced at his watch again. If he walked away now, he would still be on time. If he stopped, even for a little while, he might lose everything he had worked for. His chest tightened as he thought about the interviewer waiting, his empty wallet, and his dreams of finally getting ahead. But then he remembered all the times he had needed help in the past and how much it had meant when someone, even a stranger, had stepped in. He sighed deeply, walked over, and asked softly if the man needed assistance. The older man looked up with tired eyes, surprised that anyone had bothered to stop. He admitted he had no idea what was wrong, only that the car had suddenly died on him. He was supposed to be somewhere important too, but now he was stranded. Without hesitation, the younger man rolled up his sleeves and bent over the engine. He didn't know much about cars, but he knew enough to check the basics. His hands got dirty, grease smearing across his shirt cuffs, but he kept working, determined to help. Minutes passed quickly. Each tick of his watch was like a hammer striking against his chest. He knew his chances of making it to the interview were slipping away, yet something inside him told him he was exactly where he needed to be. The older man kept apologizing, telling him he should go, but he shook his head and said quietly, "Don't worry, we'll figure this out, eventually." He managed to adjust a loose connection, and the engine sputtered back to life. Relief washed over the stranger's face, and he gripped the young man's hand tightly, thanking him over and over again. The gratitude in the man's eyes was worth something money could never buy, yet at the same time, a sinking feeling filled the helper's stomach. He checked his watch again, and his heart dropped. The bus was gone. The interview would already be starting without him. The walk back to the bus stop felt heavier than ever. His shoes scuffed against the pavement, and his once neat clothes were now marked with grease stains. He tried not to let regret drown him, but the thought of what he had lost pressed down on him like a weight. He whispered to himself that maybe, somehow, another chance would come. But deep down, he knew opportunities like this didn't arrive often. When he reached home, he sat quietly by the window, staring out at the fading morning light. He replayed everything in his head, from the moment he left his apartment to the decision that changed his day. He could have walked past. He could have pretended not to see. But he hadn't. He had chosen to stop, chosen to help, chosen to put someone else's need above his own. His heart told him it was the right thing to do, but his mind worried about the price he had just paid. Still, there was a quiet peace in knowing he had done something good. Life hadn't been easy for him, and he knew how it felt to be helpless. If nothing else, at least today he had eased someone else's burden. As he leaned back in his chair, exhausted and uncertain, he didn't know that this single choice, this one act of kindness, was about to change his life in ways he could never imagine. Asterisk. The night after missing his interview felt long and heavy. He barely touched his dinner, pushing the food around on his plate before setting it aside. His mind kept replaying the choice he had made that morning. He had helped someone in need, yes, but in doing so, he had lost a chance he might never get again. Lying awake in his small apartment, he stared at the ceiling, wondering if life would ever reward him for doing the right thing. Sleep finally came, but it was restless and filled with doubts. The next day, he dragged himself out of bed and tried to convince himself it wasn't the end of the world. Maybe the company would reschedule. Maybe another opportunity would come soon. He turned on his old laptop, checked his emails, and felt his heart sink. There it was, the rejection message. It wasn't cruel or harsh, just a polite note thanking him for applying but letting him know they had moved forward with another candidate. He stared at the screen for a long time, his chest tightening with frustration. All that preparation, all that hope, and it had slipped away. He shut the laptop and sat quietly for a while, listening to the sounds of the city outside. Somewhere in the distance, people were hurrying to work, living lives he longed to have. He thought about how different his morning could have been if he had walked past the stranded man and kept going. He could have been at that office, shaking hands, answering questions, maybe even getting hired. Instead, he was here, jobless and uncertain. But even as those thoughts swirled in his mind, another image refused to leave him. The look on the stranger's face when the car engine roared back to life. That gratitude, that relief, it had been real. And it reminded him that the world wasn't just about chasing personal gain. It was about people, about being there when someone truly needed help. That thought gave him a small comfort, even as disappointment weighed him down. Later that afternoon, he decided to step outside for some fresh air. The air carried the faint smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor on the corner, and the chatter of children playing nearby made the street feel alive. He walked aimlessly, his thoughts still tangled. He passed a cafe and thought about going in, but he couldn't afford to spend money carelessly. He kept walking until he found himself near the same street where he had seen the stranger the day before. The car was gone, of course, but the memory lingered. For a moment, he wondered about the old man. Where had he been going? Was it important? Had his help really made a difference? He would probably never know. Still, the encounter had left its mark. He told himself that even if life didn't reward him, he would always know he had done the right thing. That had to be worth something. Days went by, and the rejection from the job interview continued to sting. He tried applying for other positions, but his heart wasn't in it. Each time he filled out a form or wrote a cover letter, he felt the weight of disappointment pulling him back. It wasn't easy to shake the feeling that he had ruined his one real chance. At night, he lay awake wondering if his life would always be this way. Small apartment, little money, dreams slipping through his fingers. But deep down, he clung to a fragile hope. He reminded himself that life had strange ways of working. Sometimes a door closed so another one could open. He didn't know how or when, but he prayed silently for a sign that his kindness hadn't been in vain. Meanwhile, the older man he had helped was thinking too. That night, the stranger had told his family about the young man who had stopped on his way to something important just to help him. It was rare, he said, to find such selflessness in today's world. Most people would have walked past, pretending not to see. But this young man hadn't. The thought stayed with him, stirring something deep in his heart. On the fourth morning after the interview, the young man received his rent reminder slip under his door. His stomach tightened. He didn't have enough to cover it this month. He had been counting on the job to help him catch up, and now that hope was gone. He sat on his bed, staring at the paper, wondering how much longer he could keep up. His landlord wasn't known for patience, and the last thing he needed was trouble. Still, he folded the slip carefully, put it in his pocket, and promised himself he would try to explain. Maybe he could buy some time, maybe he could work something out. He dressed in his cleanest shirt, the same one he had ironed for the interview, and set out for the building office. His steps were heavy, and his heart raced with worry. As he walked down the hallway toward the office, he couldn't shake the thought that life seemed to be testing him, pushing him to his limits. But he also felt that maybe, just maybe, something good was waiting on the other side of all this struggle. He didn't know what it was yet, but he kept walking, unaware that the moment he opened that office door, his life would take a turn he never expected. The office door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, and the familiar smell of old papers and coffee filled the air. The property manager sat behind the desk, adjusting her glasses and looking through a stack of files. He held the rent slip in his hand, his palms damp with sweat. He cleared his throat softly, and she glanced up, recognizing him instantly. Her expression told him she already knew what he had come for. He explained quietly that he was struggling this month, that things hadn't gone the way he had hoped, and that he needed a little more time. His voice shook as he spoke, not out of fear, but from the weight of carrying disappointment after disappointment. The manager listened, nodding politely, but he could see in her eyes that she had heard such stories before. She told him she couldn't make promises without speaking to the landlord first. The word landlord made his stomach twist. He had never met the man, only heard about him. To tenants, the landlord was like a shadow always present in their lives through rent slips and notices, yet never seen. Rumors floated around about him being strict and unforgiving. The thought of his situation reaching the landlord's ears filled him with dread. Still, he thanked the manager and left quietly, trying to hide the heaviness in his steps. That evening, he sat by the window again, staring at the streetlights flickering below. Life seemed to be closing in on him from all sides. He had no job, no savings, and now the fear of losing his home hovered like a storm cloud above him. He whispered to himself that maybe he was cursed. Maybe no matter how much good he tried to do, the world would only push him down further. The rejection letter, the missed interview, the unpaid rent, it all felt like too much at once. But deep in his heart, a small flame refused to go out. He remembered the stranger's eyes, the way they had softened with gratitude when the car had started. That memory reminded him that kindness had value, even if it didn't come with a paycheck. He couldn't explain why, but holding on to that thought gave him enough strength to face another day. The following morning, he received a call from the property office. The manager asked him to come in later that afternoon to discuss his rent situation. His stomach sank, but he agreed. All day long, he could barely focus on anything else. His mind kept running wild with possibilities, eviction, warnings, maybe even being forced to leave with nowhere to go. He walked slowly toward the office when the time came, his heart pounding with each step. When he entered the office this time, the air felt different. The manager wasn't alone. Sitting beside her was the very same man he had helped on the roadside just a few days earlier. For a moment, his mind couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. The older man wore a calm expression, his hands folded neatly on the desk, but there was no mistaking him. It was the stranger, the one whose car he had fixed, the one who had thanked him so sincerely. Their eyes met, and recognition flickered immediately. The older man leaned back slightly, studying him with quiet amazement. He could see the surprise written across the young man's face, the confusion mixing with nervousness. The room felt heavy with silence for a moment, as if time itself had paused. Then the landlord smiled, a small but genuine smile, and spoke first. "So we meet again," he said softly. The young man's throat went dry. He struggled to form words, unsure whether this was a blessing or a disaster. He nodded slowly, managing only a quiet, "Yes. I remember." The property manager looked between them, puzzled by their sudden familiarity. She started to explain the tenant's situation, but the landlord raised his hand gently, signaling her to stop. His eyes never left the young man, as though he was trying to piece together the kind of person who would sacrifice his own future just to help a stranger. Landlord spoke again, his voice carrying a weight of authority but also warmth. "When you stopped that day, did you know who I was?" The young man shook his head quickly. "No, I just wanted to help." Those words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. The landlord leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He studied the young man carefully, and for a moment, the tenant felt exposed, as though every choice he had ever made was being examined. But then the landlord nodded slowly, as if he had reached a conclusion only he understood. The property manager began to ask about the rent again, but once more the landlord interrupted. "Leave this with me," he said firmly. She hesitated, then nodded and excused herself, leaving the two of them alone in the room. The young man stood there, still unsure of what was happening. He had expected a lecture, maybe even an eviction notice. Instead, he was standing face to face with the very person he had once helped without knowing it. The landlord folded his hands again and said, "You missed something important that day, didn't you?" The young man swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, I missed a job interview. It was supposed to be my chance." The landlord's eyes softened. "And yet you stayed to help me." He nodded again, unsure what else to say. His heart beat faster as he waited for the verdict. Whatever came next would change everything. The landlord leaned back, a thoughtful look on his face. "Most people would have walked past. But you didn't. And that tells me more about your character than any interview could." For the first time in days, the young man felt something stir inside him, a fragile hope, as if the world wasn't finished with him yet. He didn't know what this meant, but he knew one thing. Life was about to take a turn he never could have predicted. The silence between them felt heavy, yet it wasn't uncomfortable. The young man shifted nervously, unsure of what the landlord was thinking. He had expected this meeting to end badly, but now it seemed like something entirely different was unfolding. The landlord leaned forward again, his eyes sharp but kind, like someone who had lived long enough to know the difference between empty words and genuine actions. "You know," the landlord began slowly, "when my car broke down that morning, I stood there watching dozens of people pass by. They looked at me, some even slowed down, but no one stopped. Everyone was too busy, too focused on their own lives. I was ready to give up when you appeared. You didn't hesitate. You sacrificed your own time to help me, a stranger." He paused, his gaze steady. "Now I see that your sacrifice was even greater than I imagined." The young man lowered his head, his voice quiet. "I couldn't just walk away. You looked like you needed help. I thought maybe I could fix it, even if it meant being late." The landlord smiled faintly, though his eyes carried a depth of thought. "Late, and you missed your interview entirely." Hearing those words out loud stung, but the young man nodded. "Yes, it was a good opportunity. Maybe the best I've had in a long time." He sighed, his shoulders sinking. "But I couldn't leave you stranded. I thought, if it was me in your place, I'd want someone to stop." The landlord leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable for a moment. The young man's heart pounded, waiting for some kind of judgment. Would the landlord see him as foolish? Would he think kindness was weakness? But then, the landlord's lips curved into a small smile. "You know," he said softly, Most tenants I meet only come to me when there's a problem: late rent, broken pipes, complaints. But you showed me something rare. You showed me character. And character, young man, is worth more than money." The young man blinked, confused. He wasn't sure what the landlord meant. His rent problem was still real, and no kind words would change the fact that he had no steady income. Still, he nodded respectfully, grateful that the landlord wasn't scolding him. The landlord studied him again, as though he was trying to see beyond the surface. Then he asked, "Tell me, what kind of work were you hoping to do at that interview?" The young man hesitated, surprised by the question. It was for an assistant position in an office. Paperwork, scheduling, small tasks. Nothing big, but it would have paid enough to get by. The landlord tapped his fingers against the desk thoughtfully. "And do you believe you would have done it well?" He straightened a little, his voice firm despite his nerves. "Yes, sir. I've always been responsible. I work hard, and I don't give up easily. I just haven't been given many chances." The landlord's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city below. His voice, when it came again, was calm but carried weight. "Young man, I own more than just this building. I have several businesses, and I am always looking for people I can trust. Skills can be taught, but character is something a person must already have. And you've proven to me that you have it." The young man's eyes widened. His breath caught in his chest, and he almost didn't believe what he was hearing. Are you saying?" The landlord turned back to face him, his expression clear and steady. "I am saying that I would like to offer you a position. It won't be glamorous, and it will require hard work, but it will be steady, and it will give you a future. More importantly, I believe you will bring honesty and dedication to it. That is what I value most." For a moment, the young man felt frozen, as though the world had stopped moving. The weight of his struggles, the rejection from the interview, the fear of losing his home, all of it suddenly lifted, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. His eyes burned with emotion, and he struggled to find the right words. I don't know what to say. I never expected this." The landlord smiled warmly. "Say yes. Accept the opportunity. And promise me one thing: keep that heart of yours. The world needs more people who choose kindness, even when it costs them." Tears pricked at the young man's eyes, and he nodded firmly. "Yes, I promise." The landlord walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "Then consider your rent taken care of for now. Focus on this new beginning." The young man felt a rush of relief so powerful it almost knocked the breath out of him. The very thing he had feared, losing his home, was no longer hanging over him. Instead, he had been given something far greater: a chance to start fresh. As he walked out of the office that day, the sun seemed brighter, the air lighter. For the first time in a long while, he felt like the world wasn't against him. He had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing: his choice to help a stranger had changed everything. And little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test him in new ways, but also open doors he had never dared to dream of. The walk back to his apartment that afternoon felt completely different from all the other times he had dragged himself through those same streets. His steps were lighter. His heart was no longer weighed down with worry, and for the first time in what felt like years, there was a genuine smile on his face. The world around him hadn't changed. The traffic still hummed, the vendors still called out to passers-by, and children still laughed and chased each other near the sidewalks. But inside him, everything was new. He kept replaying the conversation in his head, hardly able to believe it was real. Just days ago, he had been crushed by rejection, weighed down by bills, and haunted by the fear of losing his home. And now, the very man he had helped, just because it felt right, had turned out to be the landlord who held his future in his hands. More than that, The landlord had offered him something far greater than forgiveness, an opportunity. That night, he didn't sit at his window in silence like before. Instead, he wrote down a plan for the coming weeks. He listed what he would need for the new job, the clothes he had to prepare, the skills he wanted to brush up on. For once, his thoughts weren't filled with regret or self-doubt. They were full of anticipation. He whispered to himself that maybe life had been testing him all along, waiting for the right moment to turn everything around. The following week, he began working for the landlord's company. At first, the tasks were simple: organizing files, delivering messages, and helping with small projects. But he treated every task with care, determined not to waste the chance he had been given. He arrived early, stayed late, and learned quickly. People around the office began to notice his dedication. He wasn't the most skilled, but he was dependable, respectful, and always ready to help. The landlord checked in on him from time to time, never forgetting the day they met. "How are you settling in?" he asked one afternoon. The young man smiled, his answer sincere. "I'm grateful, sir." More than I can say. Weeks turned into months, and slowly his life began to change. The rent that once terrified him became manageable. He no longer skipped meals to save money. He even started sending a little home to his parents, something he hadn't been able to do in years. With each passing day, he felt a sense of pride return to him, a pride that came not from wealth, but from knowing he had earned his place honestly. But more than the job, what stayed with him most was the lesson that had brought him here: kindness. That one decision, to stop and help a stranger even at great cost to himself, had rewritten his future. He often thought about how easy it would have been to keep walking that morning, to put his own needs above someone else's, but he hadn't, and because of that, life had opened a door he never could have imagined. One evening, long after work, the landlord invited him to dinner at his home. The house was large and beautifully kept, a clear sign of success. Yet, it wasn't the wealth that impressed the young man, it was the warmth. The landlord introduced him to his family, and over the meal, he shared the story of how they had met. His children listened wide-eyed as their father explained how a simple act of kindness had reminded him of the values he cherished most. The young man felt humbled hearing his story told that way. He wasn't a hero, he thought. He had only done what anyone should do. But the landlord shook his head and said, "No, not everyone would have stopped. You remind me that true wealth isn't measured in money. It's measured in the goodness we carry inside us." That night, as he walked home under the glow of streetlights, he realized something important. Success wasn't about titles or salaries. It was about living with integrity, about making choices that reflected the kind of person he wanted to be. And sometimes, the world had a way of rewarding those choices when they were least expected. Months later, when he was promoted to a more permanent role in the company, he stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, the same one he had worn on the day of the missed interview. But this time, there was no anxiety, no fear, only gratitude. He smiled at his reflection and thought about how life had led him here, through disappointment, sacrifice, and finally, redemption. He never forgot that day on the roadside, and whenever he saw someone in need, he didn't hesitate to stop and help. He knew now that kindness might not always bring instant rewards, but it always mattered. And sometimes, when you least expect it, kindness comes back to you in ways far greater than you ever imagined. The story of a missed interview had become the story of a new beginning. And though he once thought he had lost everything by helping a stranger, he now understood the truth. In that single moment of compassion, he had gained far more than a job. He had gained a future, a mentor, and a reminder that doing the right thing is never wasted. As he walked into his new office one morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, he whispered a quiet promise to himself. No matter how successful he became, he would never let the world harden his heart. Because the choice that had once cost him everything had, in the end, given him more than he ever dreamed possible.